Mr. President, is there anything in particular you'd like to say to people on the communist side of the wall? And Ronald Reagan, this is one of those things, I can still replay this. Ronald Reagan thought for a moment, he said, well, there's that passage about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. I mean, I've just become accustomed that I say this at the top of each show in the introductions, that I'm so excited about this week's episode. It's true every time. It's really true today for a couple of reasons. I've admired our guest here, who feels like a friend, even though this is only the second time that we've met. We're simpatico, as they like to say. Someone whose own show, Uncommon Knowledge, is the model for the Kevin Roberts Show. He does a much better job with his show, but the simple concept of finding someone interesting to talk to and asking a couple of good questions and letting them run with it, this really is my guest's idea. And he's also the Murdoch Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution, a great institution on the political right in this country, a longtime institutional friend of the Heritage Foundation. That's a long way of saying, welcome to the Kevin Roberts Show, Peter Robinson.
Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. I will do a show anytime, anywhere with a man who works in Washington, but wears cowboy boots and drives to the office in a truck.
That is great. And you know what? We need more people driving to offices in D.C. in a truck wearing boots. I do have some colleagues at Heritage, by the way, who, after I was here for a few months, came up to me. They were dead serious. I mean, this is how wonderful the culture at Heritage is. People want to be, compliance, not the right word, because that's not what we're looking for, right? But they just kind of want to see how far they have to go in mimicking the boss. And a couple of the guys came up and said, Kevin, do I really need to start wearing boots? And my response is, and I still get asked this, only if you can pull it off naturally.
Ooh, that actually narrows the field very quickly.
Pretty significantly. Yeah. Thanks for being here. And we were talking off camera. We'll bring that wonderful conversation into this recorded conversation. I really do mean it personally. I mean it as a son of the Reagan Revolution. And on behalf of everyone associated with the Heritage Foundation, thank you for everything you've done for this country and continue to do.
Thank you. Thank you. That's quite moving, which means I'll put it aside as fast as I can. What is there to say except to remind you of something, to remind viewers, to let everybody in on what you already know, which is that the Heritage Foundation played a central role in what took place in the 1980s. We can talk, I have a feeling you may want to talk about this at some point, but we can talk about, let's see, this week we are celebrating 2 Ronald Reagan anniversaries, of which I am aware. One is the 20th anniversary of his funeral. He's been gone for 20 years. And of course, he'd been out of office some good number of years before then. And yesterday, I had completely forgotten this, but Twitter reminded me in the morning. Yesterday was the 37th anniversary of the Berlin Wall address. All right, so why on earth are we still talking about Ronald Reagan? And it seems to me fair for some on our side to say, stop that. It's our time. The issues are, all that is true. But where Reagan seems to me of direct relevance, of permanent relevance, it's an aspect of his character that doesn't get commented on as often as it should. And that is that Ronald Reagan read widely and wrote constantly. He was working out what it was in the American founding, the American principles that were of permanent value. And then he was working out how to apply those principles to the issues of that day. And that is the work of the Heritage Foundation. That was the work of the Heritage Foundation then, and it remains the work of the Heritage Foundation today. By the time Reagan became president in 1980, the Cold War had been going on. You can date the beginning of the Cold War at different points, but it had been going on. I date it from 1946, when Harry Truman gave his speech to a joint session of Congress announcing that the United States was going to give aid to countries that were fighting foreign influence, aid to Greece and Turkey. That's the moment when the United States says it's going to push back. So the Cold War is going on for several decades by the time he becomes president. And by the time he became president, he and people associated with this institution, including Milton Friedman, Cap Weinberger, George Shultz, there were people who had been working the problem for years and had reached conclusions. My reading, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, but my reading is we're in a new moment. We're at the beginning. We don't have as much time, perhaps. We may not have decades, but we're at the beginning of the hard work of thinking and analyzing and persuading our fellow Americans about this new moment. We're facing China. The Soviet Union no longer even exists. We have technology which could lead to wonders and economic growth of the kind we haven't experienced yet, but could also be used and is being used in China to impose the kind of surveillance of which the KGB could never even have dreamed. And on it goes. We are in a new moment, and it feels to me that the hard work is just beginning, but is very urgent.
I agree with all of that, actually. And sometimes I get asked the question often by members of the media, some of them from more or less right of center, politically speaking, outlets like the Wall Street Journal. Why is it, for example, this is related to your question, why is it, for example, that Heritage is, quote unquote, leaving Reaganism behind? And I mean, that nothing could.
So how do you answer that?
Nothing could be further from the truth. But your question reminded me of that. And what's interesting for me, and I'll talk about our institutional response, but personally, having basically been raised by two of the first proponents for Ronald Reagan in Louisiana, my grandparents, both of them Marine Corps veterans, they literally would have taken a bullet for Ronald Reagan. And I remember even before he was elected president, listening to the radio addresses. And I mean, both of my grandparents, but particularly my grandmother, revered him. She was from Illinois, so she sort of felt this connection to him. And all of that to say, for my generation, Generation X, who have great fondness and appreciation for Ronald Reagan, two things can be true at once. This is, for example, what I try to explain to our friends at the Wall Street Journal. We recently had a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation about this point. Two things can be true. What I just said, this fondness, appreciation, this permanent legacy of Reagan, and this other thing which you touched on, which is America's different in 2024. I wish Reagan were around today to help lead us through this, navigate it, or at least whisper some advice in our ears. But all of that to say, we can apply what we've learned from Reagan's leadership, certainly apply the principles that he revitalized the application of. But I think he would also, tell me if you think I'm mistaken, implore us to recognize the 2020s are different.
Absolutely.
And in particular, to make a little bit of what sounds like a pessimistic note, but it's more realistic because I'm ultimately hopeful about everything. America's a lot weaker today than it was in the 1980s. And I never thought that I would say that because I remember doing, quote unquote, tornado drills in the 1980s, but they were really nuclear drills. Like we're going to be saved by putting our heads under a desk, right? That the United States would never ultimately prevail over the Soviet Union, which we did just later that decade because of Reagan and Bush. But to continue the thought, I think that the United States today, in terms of socioeconomic metrics, our military strength, even our moral authority around the world, as I travel much of the world waving the heritage flag, all of that's weaker. But Reagan also proved that that can be true and it can be reversed. And so I think to kind of get to a punchline here, Peter, that we have a lot of things still to learn from Reagan. One of the things we try to do here at Heritage is acknowledge, especially to our friends on the right, the so-called new right, we understand why you're saying that maybe we, quote unquote, talk about Reagan too much. I get what you're saying. What they're really saying is not that they don't appreciate the man. They don't appreciate that maybe the movement hasn't moved on to confront the realities of the 2020s. But I also say, guys, that doesn't mean you need to forsake what we've learned from him. And I actually think, to conclude on a positive note here, in the last 6, 9, 12 months, there's been real progress there, just within the political right, even though we've got some fratricide, it seems like sometimes.
Kevin, do you mean to tell me that our side is making progress?
I am.
What?
It's all supposed to be bad, Peter. I know this.
I know. The world.
Yeah, but don't you see that progress yourself?
Yeah.
We're not there yet because, as you said, it really is the beginning of something new. It's the beginning of what I call the new conservative movement, which I should be clear, I don't think has any new principles. I don't think we have the power to do that. These principles are immutable. But the application of those principles based on the different realities that we're facing, I think Reagan would implore us to get busy about.
Absolutely right. So why don't we just take a couple of issues? I'm going to look. You're supposedly interviewing me, but I want to hear what
this
you have
is
to
going
say.
exactly the way I thought it would, which is that you would turn the table and start asking me questions,
Well,
which,
okay.
by the way, is fine.
So what I get, first of all, in my opinion, as I've observed this, you're exactly right. There's a generational element, which is totally understandable. Back in the 80s, when I was a kid in the Reagan White House, there were still Democrats who were talking about Franklin Roosevelt as the great figure. And there were young Democrats who were saying, enough of that, it's our time. And it's just part. Yesterday, I went across to the Rayburn House office building where the Young Americans Foundation was having a seminar for Hill interns. And I said, by the way, today's the 37th anniversary of the Berlin Wall address. Is there anyone in the room 37 or older? And the photographer at the back of the room raised his hand, and 200 kids just sat there. So I kept lowering the age. When I got to 21, a few hands went up. All right, you get the picture. Before even talking about Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, I had to explain what the wall was, what the Cold War. It's just gone. That's normal. That is the way generations proceed. Okay, so there's that. But then you must get over and over again, well, Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty for illegal aliens. He'd be on Joe Biden's side on the border. That's nonsense, of course. He grew up during that long pause in American immigration. What was the Immigration Act of 1924? We have very tight quotas, and that goes on all the way through 1965. That's the world in which President Reagan grew up. The 1986, I have to, again, people don't remember this, or a large part of the audience was born after all of this, so let me take a moment to set it up. You know the history. The 1986 bill that he signed contained two features. One was an amnesty for a little under 3 million people who had been here since at least 1980. But the other was a long series of provisions to stop illegal immigration. Those provisions were never enforced. Ronald Reagan was welcoming to Hispanic culture particularly. He remembered the Braceros program in the old days where Mexican workers could come to California and work and then go back home. He was totally comfortable, in particular with Mexicans, with Hispanic culture. All that is true. But he believed in the rule of law extending to the border. There is no doubt that were he with us today, zero doubt, he would look at a border which has essentially collapsed. He would hear that during this administration, the Biden administration, we don't know how many people have come in illegally, but the best estimates run to the high millions. And Ronald Reagan would say, how did you people let this happen?
Because
get to work on it.
To allow that porous border is to undermine the rule of law, which is to undermine the nation state.
Exactly right.
And just to use that issue as an example, it is absurd on its face that someone would say that Reagan would be on Biden's side on this. But I've become real enamored with the reminder that some of our fellow conservatives make for us that part of conservatism, while we appreciate the free market globally, is to remember the preeminence of the nation state. And I will tell you, I think I've always appreciated that, but in the last 2.5 years leading Heritage, as we play this role and hopefully recohering the political center right in this country, that's a component of this conversation across the right that we try to bring to the fore. And it doesn't mean that under the guise of so-called nationalism, you should get away with anything that you want. It's to say that particularly in the American context, that the nation state is vital. I do think that that's one of the things Reagan would remind us of if he were sitting here today.
I agree. There were issues. He had a job to do. And like other human beings in big jobs, I'm sure, Kevin, you, because you know how to run organizations, you have in your head about 3 important things that you want to get done. Now, there are 30 subdivisions. Ronald Reagan wanted to defeat Soviet communism, restore growth to the American economy, and restore some sense of American morale. Now, there were a lot of things that in those days were not issues. Why? Because we could take them for granted. In those days, you didn't have to say, excuse me, we really need to reassert the importance of families. We need to draw distinctions between men and women. We should think hard before permitting males to play in women's sport. This would have seemed crazy talk 40 years ago during the 1980s. Had they been issues in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, you could count on him to have addressed them. So there were all kinds of things that were implicit in his view of the country. I have decided, this came into my head because I'm slow off the mark, Kevin.
That's hard to believe.
Oh, no. I was jogging. I went on well, I don't really jog anymore. I hobble. I went on my daily hobble, and I hobbled in front of the Supreme Court. And there's somebody who had a sign up that said, I think the sign said something like, nationalism is not Christian. It was some play on Christian nationalism. And I thought, wait a minute. Once the other side starts calling it nationalism, they're tying love of country to fascism in the 19th. Let's just call it patriotism.
That's the easiest way to handle it.
That is the way to handle it. Was Ronald Reagan patriotic? Did he have a sense of America, of a specific geographic location, of a particular culture? In fact, it all was people, Reagan stories, senior staffers who would get into the limousine with President Reagan thinking that they would finally get his attention and make him sign this document, or they could brief him on this or that. They would always be frustrated because what he loved to do in the limousine, even going around town here from one place to another, is look out the window and wave at people. Airplanes, Air Force One, again, the same kind of thing. People would go to the forward cabin thinking they'd get his attention, and he would just love looking out the window at the country as it slid past. And as opposed to our liberal or progressive or woke brethren who claim they love America, and I'm willing to admit that they do, but what they love is America as they think it should be.
Mm-hmm. As a vehicle for social justice.
When they get done with it, they'll love it. That's sort of the way. But Reagan, and this is part of, conservatives are conservative because they see all around them things they want to conserve right now. And Reagan loved the country as it was. He loved movies. He loved listening to Frank Sinatra. He loved riding his horses on the ridgeline in the Santa Ynez Mountains. He just loved the place as it was.
And it occurred to me as you were emphasizing that wonderful point, that in the 80s, and I would argue even into the 1990s, almost every major politically liberal figure, loved America too. Tip O'Neill loved America just as much as Reagan.
Yes.
Walter Mondale. It wasn't that they were, they had some crazy ideas, don't get me wrong, politically, but in terms of loving America for what it was at that point, the point that I'm driving at, Peter, is it's the political left that's really changed.
Correct.
And now I mean this to be more of a tactical point than one about policy, substance, or philosophy. One of the things the political right has been late in recognizing is that for the better part of the last generation politically, the left is kicking our teeth in. They do politics much better than we do. And the key word that you uttered a few moments ago is there's an urgency of the moment. Mm-hmm. We can be realistic, not pessimistic, in recognizing that we've got to get busy with this. There always needs to be a time for the intellectual debates, which are happening right now. On the right, praise God, there's an election, because that tends to be a cohesive kind of force, right? Even though people are going to have different opinions about who the standard bearer is, whoever he or she is in a given year, the point is we're on the brink of governing again, and we have to settle some of these debates. What advice do you think Reagan would give us in 2024? We've covered the ideology side, but just about the tactics of politics. I know that he would not be gratuitously ugly or critical even of the other side, but I will confess to you, and I think most of my heritage colleagues would confess to you, that even though we are naturally cheerful and we really are naturally hopeful, there are days working in proximity to Capitol Hill when we want to go kick some teeth into. We won't, but it's tempting.
What would Reagan say about the current moment? We have in our minds, I believe, I shouldn't say we, but I will. The current generation, the kids who don't remember him, will look on YouTube and they'll see Reagan giving speeches, or they'll see there's one collection of Reagan's humor after another on YouTube. You can see him giving jokes. And he was president in the last phase of his life. But I had a conversation, this is years and years and years ago, with Judge Clark, who knew him as well as anybody. Actually, I came to the conclusion that Judge Clark, who served as national security advisor in the White House and went on to become undersecretary in the Interior, but he was a friend of Ronald Reagan, and Reagan had very few real friends. He'd known him from California. And Judge Clark was also himself a man of very great deep faith. And he said it was providential that Reagan became president when he did become president, because earlier in his career, he was too hot. And in fact, if you go to YouTube, when you're on YouTube and you type in Reagan plus Berkeley unrest.
Yeah, that's what just came to my mind.
And you see Ronald Reagan hollering at students and arguing with faculty. Ronald Reagan was willing to mix it up. He was willing, he was a man who felt anger and expressed it when there were things to be angry about. So I also believe that I'm just saying obvious things here, but 51 intelligence officers signed a statement saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. The FBI must surely quickly have confirmed that it was real. The intelligence services knew better. Now even the New York Times admits that it was real. 51 intelligence. These are people who are trusted with operating. We don't even know the CIA's budget. They are in the positions of the greatest sensitivity and the greatest trust of the American people, and they intentionally misled the public. Ronald Reagan would be so shocked and so angry that he would join boots-wearing Kevin Roberts and me in saying, those people must be stopped. They just must be stopped, I believe.
There's no doubt in my mind that would happen.
So if people say, oh, Reagan's, of course he's irrelevant in the strict sense. The man has been gone for 2 decades. But if they say, no, there was a softness about him that's out.
That's kind of the point that people are, or the aspect of him that people are leaning on.
I can understand that, because by the time he was president, and particularly in the second term, on the other hand, I tell this story about this speech of 37 years ago, the Berlin Wall speech. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I'm sure you've heard this, but the State Department and the National Security Council wanted that line out. And because it was too provocative, it was going to put Gorbachev in a difficult position. And Ronald Reagan overruled George Shultz and the entire State Department and Colin Powell and the entire national security. And this is in the second half of his term, when he's supposedly a grandfatherly, gentle figure. Actually, he was quite willful. When he knew his mind, he intended to act on his own mind. And if you listen to him deliver that one line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, one of the reasons it's memorable is that line is hot. He is angry at at the injustice of that wall.
So
it was there. It was there.
Yeah, it's so apparent, and I want to get into your role in that, which I know you have recounted before, but I'll prevail upon you to do it for the sake
for you, Kevin, anything
for heritage in this show. But I mean, I remember that moment vividly as a young teenager.
That means you're over 37.
That is correct. I'm a bit over 37. I remember it vividly because, as I mentioned earlier, my grandparents were such lovers of Reagan, as my mom was and is. But I was also a political nerd, and so it's paying attention. And at the time, for those of us in Generation X, my wife would say the same thing. You grew up kind of worried, at least in the back of your mind, that at some point the Soviets would get kind of crazy,
yes, and
there would be a nuclear war. But all of that to say, yesterday, which was the anniversary of the Berlin Wall speech. This episode will drop a few days thereafter, but I listened to that line over and over and over on the way home. I had it on a recording, and it's interesting you said what you said about the line being hot.
Did it feel that way to you?
It felt that way to me yesterday. In 1987, it felt like my grandfather delivering it, meaning there's authority. Not that there's a softness, but just sort of there's a resoluteness that's kind of calm.
Right.
But yesterday I heard the heat, and I thought, boy, that would be really helpful today if more of our political leaders, especially on the right, but maybe on the center left too, would be hot less often. That way, when they are hot, it really has meaning.
He explained. I did not talk to him about this afterwards, but I read an interview that he gave after he left office. He explained that he got to the site where he delivered the speech, which was right in front of the Berlin Wall, and he was shown over the wall. He climbed up an observation platform and looked over the wall into East Berlin, the communist side of the wall. And he was told, he said in this interview, he was told that earlier that day, East Berliners had begun to gather to hear him speak. They knew the American president was going to give a speech. And the police, the East German police, the communist police, had driven them away. And he said he thought of that as he was delivering the line. And the anger was not an actor's anger. That anger was genuine anger. So there is a place, what is it? We don't want to be angry people. We don't want to act out of anger or rashness or pure heat. But isn't it someplace, you'll know this, C.S. Lewis writes someplace that we have a capacity for anger because there are moments when it's appropriate. And borders that have collapsed, 9 million people coming in, a budget that has been permitted, a deficit that now has risen to 100. When in the old days meaning 10 years ago, not even that old days. So as I recall, it was in the 90s, there was a study. I'm at the Hoover Institution where I have a number of colleagues who are economists. I'm not an economist, but I talk to economists. That's my
So therefore
credential.
you are one.
Yeah, sort of, good enough. But there were several studies that indicated that once a national debt reaches 100% of GDP, the debt becomes as big as the national output of goods and services in a year, that there's all kinds of evidence that begins to, there are interest payments, that it begins to weigh on the economy and it retards growth. Well, that was purely theoretical for this country back in the 1990s. Our debt today is almost 130% of GDP. Our borders are not being enforced. We have, oh man, now so you see, if you get me started, Kevin, and all you're just sitting there smiling and nodding. No,
the heat's coming out.
I love good journalism. And I return to this notion that our intelligence services have been corrupted to the extent that 51 senior intelligence officials intentionally misled and Trump is supposed to be the threat to democracy? All right. We're allowed to get a little hot.
Amen.
In this election year. We're allowed to get a little hot.
Tell us, we'll switch gears, we'll come back to that in the second half of this conversation. Tell us, before it becomes too distant in the conversation, about how it was that Peter Robinson found himself drafting what we now know to be the Berlin Wall speech.
I'd been in the White House for 5 years at that point. Is that right? Yes, 5 years. I was spring of 1987. I'll compress this. It was a big moment in my life.
Well,
Kevin,
I would think so.
I could take you through it day by day in real time, but that means this podcast would last several days.
We'll have you back many times over the years.
Okay.
There's another chance.
Okay. So the president was going to go to an economic summit in Venice. And the White House received a communication from Chancellor Kohl of West Germany. It turned out that the city of Berlin was celebrating a big anniversary. It's 750th. I don't recall which anniversary, but some multi-century anniversary. Queen Elizabeth had already visited, and Gorbachev was going to visit East Berlin as part of these celebrations. So the Kohl government considered it very important for the American president to visit West Berlin to offset the visit from Gorbachev. The White House accepted. Robinson gets the assignment. In other words, it gets added to the schedule just a couple of months' notice, which is unusual for a big speech. And I'm told where he'll stand, and the audience will be about 40,000, half an hour, and it's got to be on foreign policy. So I go with the American advance team to West Berlin, went to the place where the president would speak. Kevin, this is the problem. If you didn't see it, you won't get it. And that's not really good enough. It's our job to make history accessible, isn't it? That's a
right.
big piece of what people in your position and mine, it's really our duty to do our best. So I can tell you that if you climbed the observation platform, as I did, and looked over the wall into East Berlin, behind you in West Berlin, you had a what felt like a normal city.
Mm-hmm.
Neon lights, lots of Mercedes-Benzes whizzing around, people well-dressed, busy, going places. And you look over the wall, silence, colorlessness, drabness. There's no bright color anywhere. Everything is gray or dark. You can see the buildings you can still see a lot of damage from the Second World War. All these decades later, lots of buildings haven't been rebuilt. Only a few pedestrians. I stood there for 10 or 15 minutes. I saw only 2 cars and far more soldiers than pedestrians. So it was just, you could feel. I remember looking up the word oppression because, and the etymology is that it actually comes from a sense of weight, of being pushed down on. And you could actually feel, it was almost as though the air pressure were heavier there somehow. It was the weight of history. All right. So I thought, oh my Lord, what do I give Reagan that will be equal to this place? Went to the ranking American diplomat in West Berlin. That was my next stop. He told me all the things Ronald Reagan shouldn't say, including don't make a big deal about the wall. They've all gotten used to it. I was given a ride over the wall in a U.S. Army helicopter. And you could see on the other side, dog runs, guard towers, a killing zone. And the killing zone was used to kill people. Many people were killed trying to escape. And then in the evening, I went to a West Berlin's a suburb, for a dinner party with West Berliners. It was a host and hostess. We had a friend in common in Washington, but we'd never met. And I said, I've been told that you've all gotten used to the wall. Is that true? And then just silence. And I thought, oh my gosh, what have I done? And then they all looked at each other. And then one man pointed, he raised his arm and said, my sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about that wall? So they may have stopped talking about it. It had been there for more than 2 decades. But if you asked, they hated it every day. And they went around the room expressing that. Speaking of anger. And then our hostess became really lovely woman. She just died a couple of years ago. I'm sorry to say she was younger then than I am now. And she became quite angry. And she said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk, glasnost, perestroika, he can prove it. He can come here and get rid of that wall. So that went into my notebook, back to the White House, wrote a speech around the call to tear down the wall. And then there's a long story here, which I won't go into, but in the Reagan White House, this is embarrassing to say, people actually watch this? You have an audience?
They do. There are a few people. And on the weeks my wife does, there are 4.
Okay, well, as long as it's just your wife and you and me and maybe a couple of others. But the speechwriters, it was the rule in the Reagan White House that speeches would go out to staffing before the president saw them. But we speechwriters, my boss, Tony Dolan, was chief speechwriter, and there was a young guy, Tommy Griscom, was director of communications, and we 3 realized that that line was important and it was going to cause trouble with the staff. So we arranged to get it to the president so he could review it at Camp David before it went out to staffing. This happened only a half a dozen times in the White House that the president, long story. In any event, he saw it first. And then we had a meeting with him, we speechwriters. On Monday, he got the draft on a Friday. On Monday, we had a meeting in the Oval Office, talked about a number of speeches. And then we got to the Berlin speech. And I explained that I'd been told in West Berlin that people would hear him on the other side of the wall, the communist side, depended on weather conditions. But if the weather conditions were right, they could pick him up by radio all the way to Moscow. Mr. President, is there anything in particular you'd like to say to people on the communist side of the wall? And Ronald Reagan, this is one of those things, I can still replay this. Ronald Reagan thought for a moment, he said, well, there's that passage about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down. And then the speech went out to staffing. And for 3 weeks until he delivered it, the State Department and the National Security Council tried to stop it. Their problem was that the president had said in a meeting, witnesses, that he especially wanted to deliver that line. So what that meant was they had to lean on the speechwriters to change. If I, as the speechwriter, had written a memorandum, Mr. President, on mature reflection, I think maybe we should consider, he might have decided, all right, that's fine. But we speechwriters just refused to do that. And on the day he delivered the speech, now I was too junior to go on the trip, but people told me about this afterwards. On the day he delivered the speech, the State Department cabled they'd written many alternative drafts. They cabled another alternative draft to Air Force One as it was flying to, or is about to take off.
They were
Italy.
persistent.
Persistent, yes. Anyway, in the limousine on the way to the wall, the president was riding with Deputy Chief of Staff Ken Duberstein, who just died a couple of years ago. And the president said he was going to give the speech as written. And then he slapped Duberstein on the knee and said, the boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do. And then he delivered the speech. So that's Ronald Reagan. Now there's a kind of sweetness, kind of funny. It's the right thing to do. But he was one. Don't cross him. Don't cross him. That guy had the steel to stand up to the entire foreign policy apparatus of the United States and say, no, I'm calling on him to tear down the wall. There was a toughness, even an aggressiveness about that man.
There's obviously a lot of lessons there, a lesson in leadership, a lesson about what America is at its best, and the awareness of this very humble man about the authority he had, not just in his own country, but over there. And I would sit here and talk with you for hours. So maybe we can do that sometime. But I'll ask a couple more questions.
The crew's already nodding off, Kevin. I know.
That's because when I'm speaking, when you're speaking, they wake up. It's kind of a big question. We don't shy away from tough questions, but we don't do gotcha questions. We'll leave that to the mainstream media. I'm genuinely interested in picking your brain about this.
Okay.
I think this is one of the biggest questions facing the political right now, both in a more academic, think tank, intellectual sense, as well as in the middle of an election year when I happen to think the conservative standard bearer is going to win. Look at what's going on in the world. Russia continues to be a huge problem, to say the least, particularly if you're in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. We have the Iranians acting up again, to say the least. And we happen to think at Heritage that as bad as the two of them are, China poses an even bigger direct threat to the United States right now. People can quibble over the priority order. The problem is that China, Russia, and Iran are problems. Our Department of Defense, that is the policymakers, not the wonderful rank and file men and women in uniform, doesn't seem to have things in priority. We're spending way too much money in Congress. We have a society, some of whom pay more attention to pronouns than lethal force and lethal aid. And the political right is kind of fractured about what we do.
You're going to find a way to make cheer me up before you're through with this, right?
You're going to cheer us up.
Oh.
What's the answer? You know, at Heritage, we just keep proclaiming transparency and priorities and leadership. What's the recipe there from someone who knew Reagan, who's written for Reagan? You know, what advice would he give us?
I would remind you, I would remind all of my friends, I'm happy to remind myself of what he didn't know. He didn't know that wall would come down. He said it's the right thing to do, and so there's this notion in which things are bad. Well, I'll say two things. We tend now to look at. Here's the first thing I'll say. I'm trying to think. There's a lot.
There's a lot there. I know.
That's not a gotcha question. It's worse than a gotcha question. It's what have you got? That's the question. Is consider 2 years. 1979 and 1989. In 1979, the American economy was suffering stagflation. For at least the second half of the 70s, the whole economy had been going sideways. There was the Iranian hostage crisis. 53 Americans had been taken hostage day after day. As that year ticked on, it was day after day after day, Americans taken hostage in Iran. And in December, if I recall the month correctly, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the biggest land operation, military operation, anywhere on the planet since the end of the Second World War. That's 1979. 1989, by then the American economy is in the 5th year of an economic expansion. We're well on our way to a 600-ship Navy. Morale in the United States had recovered so thoroughly that although today it sounds trite, Reagan's reelection campaign of Morning Again in America rang true enough to voters to award him 49 out of 50 states. And in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. 1 decade. So the capacity for renewal is enormous. But nobody knew in 1979, including Ronald Reagan, that it would happen. There were people who had worked hard. This is the other. It's not that Reagan said what he said off the top of his head. By the way, it's also not that I wrote. The person who deserves credit for that, I did write the speech, but what was I doing? I'd spent in the White House for 5 years. I'd studied Ronald Reagan. I could hear his voice. I knew his policy positions. He'd been speaking and writing for 3 decades before he became president. So I guess what I want to say is that by the time 1979 comes along and he declares that he's running for president, Bill Buckley has devoted 3 decades of his life to the intellectual underpinnings of the conservative movement. Milton Friedman has devoted his whole life's work to understanding the importance of free markets. Ronald Reagan has been governor of California for 8 years and devoted decades to writing and thinking and working. And even at that, none of them knew what was going to happen. They were working, they did their work, they drew their conclusions, and all these men, including Ronald Reagan, I'm going to say something about Ronald Reagan that if he still has opponents, but that may strike even his supporters as odd, even his admirers as odd. Ronald Reagan was, in the strict sense of the word, an intellectual. When he believed in ideas. In fact, I think it's fair to say that he believed ideas come first, that ideas are in some way the fundamental reality. And when he reached a conclusion, he considered himself bound by it. He did what he did because he believed it was the right thing to do, not because he knew the wall would come down. That is all we can do. That is all we can do. But that much, the hard work, the thinking, the analysis, the fighting with each other, because when I push Kevin Roberts and Kevin Roberts pushes back, both of us are going to learn something. I mean, the fighting on our own side has to take place within the context of respect and patriotism. Because of the things we have in common, we're allowed to push each other around a little bit. Because we learn, it gets us better, as friends can. That's all we can do, but that much we must do. And that I think we can learn from Ronald Reagan and the whole Cold War generation. I guess the last point I'd make is, am I yakking too much?
No, I was just about to say.
Go ahead.
That you still have the ability at your advancing age to put some stirring words together. Watch
it, Buster. This...
Here comes the anger.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you know even a cursory understanding of American history shows that this country's been a near-run thing over and over and over again. Look at the election of 1800. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two heroes, correctly. Two heroes of the founding. And those men, at least they would reconcile later. One of the great treasures of American literature is the correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as old men. But during the election of 1800, they hated each other. And both sides engaged in dirty tricks. As the political system understood dirty tricks, we have different dirty tricks today. But both sides engaged in dirty tricks. And what happened in 1800? The late Harry Jaffa pointed this out to me, that as far as he was aware, 1800, the election of 1800 was the first time one side that was in power peacefully surrendered power to another side as the result of a democratic election. So it's vitriolic, it's ugly, it's full of spite, and it's one of the most magnificent moments in all of human history. Okay, you get that. You begin with Washington's retreat, George Washington, the father of the country. Well, okay, didn't look as though there was going to be a country as he was making that horrible, ignominious retreat up Manhattan Island, Valley Forge, on and on and on it goes. Harry Truman, when Harry Truman becomes president, he has no idea A, that there's a nuclear weapon that's being worked on, B, that the Soviets are liars and cheats and about to impose their power on Eastern Europe. And the great his sainted predecessor, FDR, all Harry Truman wanted to do was continue the FDR program. And Harry Truman, this plucky, tough guy from the middle of the country, has to realize that FDR was wrong, that Stalin is brutally imposing communist regimes on Eastern Europe instead of living up to the agreements he made at Yalta, and Truman, who hates Republicans. And in the election of 1946, as I recall, have I got this right? The election of 46, Republicans recapture both houses of Congress for the first time since 32, and they do it in part by running against Harry Truman. Those congressional leaders and Harry Truman cannot stand each other. And yet they pull together to vote aid to Greece and Turkey and begin our side of the Cold War. So we've been in pickles before. I'm afraid that's what we've been in pickles before.
Because we could offer multiple examples each decade, is what you're saying.
And so it goes.
To the devil's advocate, not me, but just the devil's advocate question, because I agree with you. They say, okay, I accept all of those examples because the facts are straight. But Peter, our best days are behind us.
Maybe. How the hell would I know? Maybe. Now, tell me what difference that makes to our duty.
We still have to do the same thing.
Exactly. Nobody's it is when we are called to give an account of our life. We're not going to be cut any slack because, well, I thought what was the point? Our best days were behind. No. What kind of an approach is that? We have no choice but to do our best, to take it seriously, and to do our work. There is no guarantee the American experiment. It is an experiment.
Still, and it's still young.
Still an experiment. It is still an experiment. There is no guarantee that this is all going to work. On the other hand, we can guarantee that it will fail if we don't do our work.
Peter Robinson, I honestly would sit here and talk to you for several hours, but I understand you've got a lecture to give.
The crew's out leaving. They're all walking around the block having a beer and a cigarette.
That's because they're tired of me.
Okay,
Let's have you back. Again, heartfelt from me on behalf of all of us. Thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you.
Thanks for being a friend of Heritage and a great leader of this movement. To you who've tuned in to this great episode, this conversation with our friend Peter Robinson, thanks for making the show possible. As he said, we don't really know how this is going to end, but we do know one thing. We're 100% certain about it. We have a duty, not just a job, a moral duty to keep America going. And I happen to think we're going to win. Take care.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, and Tim Kennedy. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.